Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Friends Zooms. I'm Franny Eberhardt. I'm the president of Friends of the Upper East Side Historic District, and I'm delighted to welcome a whole lot of people to this Zoom this evening. We are, for those of you who don't know us, we are an organization founded in 1982, and we are dedicated to the architectural legacy, livability, and sense of place of the Upper East Side. And if that sounds sweeping and a little vague, I urge you to go to our website to find out in detail what that means, what it has meant over time, and what it continues to mean as we pursue our mission. And one part of that is the celebration of the history of the Upper East Side, its people, its buildings, you name it. And we're just delighted, really delighted to have Lucie Levine tonight talking about hotel history on the Upper East Side. Those of you who've been part of our offerings, our public offerings online since we had to go virtual, should know that Lucie has been one of the impresarios who's been behind all of these, almost all of these. We've had a variety of people stirring the pot and talking about some really interesting things. Lucie is the definition of a history buff. It was her academic interest and degree, and she has a whole variety of different outlets, both virtual now, walking tours, writing, and so on. So some of you may have run into her in other places, but we really treasure what she has brought to us here at Friends with our virtual series. And so tonight you will be able to see another product of hers. I think actually, Lucie, the first thing we posted, I think, was the history of housing, right as the pandemic was starting. And that was brilliant as well. So I invite all of you to go look at what we have. You can see anything you missed on our website. And we'll get going very shortly. I just wanted to let you know that another one of our impresarios is Lara Sakine, who is behind the scenes here, the wizard behind the scenes. And if you have questions as we go along, you just send them to us, if you would please, on the chat. And then at the end, Lara will collect those questions and give them to Lucie to answer so we can have a bit of a dialogue. So that's my introduction. Again, welcome. And Lucie, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. My name is Lucie. What a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Franny, and thank you to Friends for having me. What a fun topic to speak about this evening. The history of hotels, hotel architecture, and the social goings-on within hotels on the Upper East Side. I suggested this particular talk to Friends because today, the hotels of the Upper East Side in particular, but throughout the city, have really stepped up in this moment of pandemic, first as housing for essential workers and then for unhoused New Yorkers. And so hotels today are really on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic, but this is not the first time that hotels throughout the city have had a great deal of impact within and upon the city's history. So this is a look back at the central role that these hotels have played, particularly on the Upper East Side. So thank you so much. This will be both a look at architectural history and social history. Now, the hotels of the Upper East Side in particular illustrate the relationship between architecture and New York society in a really interesting, instructive, and quite literal way. And that's because all of the hotels that we're going to talk about today, so the Plaza, the Savoy Plaza, which was demolished actually in 1965 prior to the passage of the Landmarks Law, the Sherry Netherland, which is still with us, the Pierre, and the Carlyle, were all actually built either in whole or in part as apartment hotels, catering for the most part to wealthy permanent residents. Now, the reason I bring that up at the very beginning of this talk is that there were many apartment hotels, not just these, but even more than we are aware of today, built on the Upper East Side in the early part of the 20th century. Now, why? Well, the Landmarks Preservation Commission in 1981, when it designated the Upper East Side Historic District, wrote that the most important factor in changing the architectural character of the district was the advent of tall luxury apartment houses Many of the mansions and townhouses of Fifth Avenue, as well as the row houses of Madison Avenue and Park Avenue, as well as stables, carriage houses, and row houses on blocks just east of Park Avenue, were sold to realty and development corporations, and large luxury apartment houses were constructed on their sites. Now, the report goes on to state that the majority development force on Madison Avenue in the 20th century was the appearance of tall apartment buildings and apartment hotels. So the hotels that we're talking about today are specifically part of this development and are indicative of the changes in the way that people lived in New York in and around the turn of the 20th century. So what we're looking at when we look at these hotels, which today are emblems of grandeur, but also of transience in a way, right? Actually were not that when they were built. They were a redefinition of luxury in New York City when they were built. And they telegraphed a change in architecture, but not a change in sentiment from the Gilded Age mansions of Fifth Avenue towards the mode of Art Deco skyscraper design. Now, I think that the Pierre, which was built in 1930, and the Sherry Netherland, which was built in 1927, illustrate this point really well, because both the Pierre and the Sherry Netherland were built either directly on the site of or using the remnants of Gilded Age mansions. They were also each designed by the same architects. They were both designed by Schultz and Weaver, the firm which also designed the Waldorf Astoria in 1931. Now, let's talk about what I mean. Well, okay, so the Pierre at 2E 61st Street was built by Charles Pierre on the site of the Elbridge Gerry Mansion. So this is the Elbridge T. Gerry Mansion. He was the scion of the Gerry family, from which we get the term gerrymandering. Now, this mansion, built 1895, was designed by Richard Morris Hunt, very famous as the first American to attend l'École des Beaux-Arts, and also famous for the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, among other extraordinary buildings within our historic district. Now, the Pierre, which was built on this site, was built essentially as a clubhouse for wealthy Upper East Siders, among them Gerry himself, but including also Otto Kahn, Walter Chrysler, and Herbert Pratt. Now, the goal of these sort of scions of the East Side was to create the atmosphere of a private club or residence where the apartments themselves will be unusual in the size of the rooms, of which will be larger than living rooms of country houses. Now, here's Charles Pierre. It's a grainy photo, I'm sorry about that, but it's actually from his obituary in the Times in 1955. Now, Charles Pierre is an interesting character within this world because he grew up so much within it, but he was not part of initially that group of men, right? He didn't come from the ranks of somebody like Otto Kahn or Walter Chrysler or Herbert Pratt. He actually was an immigrant from Corsica, and he rose through the ranks working for the restaurateur Louis Sherry, who we'll get to in a moment. But Pierre spent actually 9 years at Louis Sherry's restaurant. And then he worked for the Ritz-Carlton, and then he opened his own restaurant called Pierre's at 230 Park Avenue, which is today the Helmsley Building. Now, finally, in 1930, he opened the Pierre on the very site of the Gerry Mansion. But the reason that I bring up Louis Sherry at this moment is that he is the namesake of the Sherry Netherland, which is how we can see how small this very elite world was. Now, Sherry's restaurant had been located in several locations throughout the city of New York, but moved to this hotel, the New Netherland Hotel, in 1919. And the New Netherland Hotel was actually raised in 1926 to make room for the Sherry Netherland. By that time, Sherry himself had actually died. So while his restaurant gave its name to the Sherry Netherland, he was not actually involved. Now, why do I mention this? Why does this matter? Well, the New Netherland Hotel, which you see here, as I said, was raised in 1926 to make room for the new hotel, but it was not the only thing that was being knocked down that year. So too was this. This is the Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion at 1 West 57th Street, which was designed by George B. Post and again, Richard Morris Hunt. Now, what's interesting to me here is that when we look inside the Sherry Netherland, we can actually see that history. So if we look back at this mansion, the limestone panels and ornamental friezes that were installed first by Hunt and by Post in this mansion were then installed within the Sherry Netherland itself. So we have sort of this renaissance, if you like, of New York architecture, that we are moving from one type of architecture, from these great Gilded Age mansions, into these apartment hotels, but we are not changing the milieu of the Upper East Side, and we're not really changing in any way the sensibility that this type of grandeur was at home. Even though the style of living in New York had become outmoded when we're talking about these great Gilded Age mansions, the goal of that type of opulence had not left the taste of Upper East Siders. And you might be thinking, well, why? Right? If you're just going to reuse the friezes, what's the point of knocking down something like this? What a beautiful mansion. Why not keep it? Well, the real answer is twofold. One, to some degree, is the First World War, and the other is having to do with servants. So what's particular about apartment hotels is that you did not have to employ servants in the way that you would need to within those Gilded Age mansions. And because of the First World War, in fact, and this is a kind of interesting, the way that history moves us across the world, and something going on, say, on the battlefields of Europe, actually having a direct correlation to the city of New York, which is to say, first of all, that there was a sort of a drying up of building during the war years, and also that because the First World War killed 10 million people, many of those young men, if they had come from the working classes of, say, Britain, would have perhaps made their way into the servant class in New York, and didn't because of the war. And so what these apartment hotels and other hotels which were built in New York began to offer was the kind of amenities that the great Gilded Age mansions could provide, but without the stress and the cost and the upkeep associated with these major mansions. So, for example, the Plaza Hotel, this is a photo from 1950, so not really associated with the First World War, but you do see a bartender. So the Plaza Hotel, when it opened, employed a staff of 1,500, which included 50 each of chambermaids, housemaids, bellboys, plus 200 waiters, 75 laundresses, 25 porters, as well as 20 bartenders, 10 wine cellar men, 15 barbers, and in later years, 2 men whose sole job it was to dust the chandeliers, and another who patrolled the hallways stamping ashtrays with the Double P Plaza logo. Now, many of those original workers at the Plaza actually earned 83 cents a day when the Plaza opened in 1907, and they got no paid time off. And there was some Sturm und Drang around that. In fact, when the Plaza was being built in 1906, so it opens 1907, and before it opens, there is a bit of a labor uprising, and one of the foremen on the job was actually pushed off the scaffolding because the workers were so displeased with their working conditions. But labor uprising or no, the hotel is finished, and who should move in? Well, what were we just looking at, right? We were just looking at the Vanderbilt mansion, and who should move into the Plaza as the very first person to sign the register? None other than this man, Alfred G. Vanderbilt, right? So we're looking not so much at social change when we look at these hotels, but at social transfer. So again, we go from these great Gilded Age mansions to these apartment hotels without losing the kind of opulence that we had before. So speaking of opulence, let's look at this. This is actually quite beautiful. I love this photo. This is from the Museum of the City of New York. This photo was taken in 1909 as part of the Hudson-Fulton celebration. Of course, 300 years since Henry Hudson had sailed into New York Harbor, 1609, and Fulton operating the first steam ferry between Manhattan and Brooklyn in 1809. So both of those things celebrated in this photograph. So Henry Hardenberg, when he designs the Plaza, it is a French Renaissance chateau. Now, Ada Louise Huxtable, who was the actually first architecture critic in the New York Times, the first person to be appointed to that post, called the Plaza New York's most celebrated symbol of cosmopolitan and turn-of-the-century splendor inside and out. It is no surprise that Henry Hardenberg was chosen to design the Plaza Hotel with the clear intention of it becoming a landmark, which of course it has become both inside and out, because Hardenberg himself actually set the standard for modern hotel design when he designed the Waldorf and Astoria hotels. Now, these stood on the original site of what is now the Empire State Building. And speaking of originals, there was an original Plaza even before Henry Hardenberg got his hands on it. This is the original Plaza Hotel. This was designed chiefly by McKim, Mead, and White. Now, what's interesting to me is that because we had an old Plaza, I'll go back. The Plaza, when it opened, was actually called the New Plaza. And most of the residents who lived here were actually permanent residents. When this hotel opened, 90% of the people who took rooms here did so permanently. And the reason that I mention that is because when we think of hotels today, we often think of transients. We think of people coming in from out of town, of people holiday, sojourning, and so on and so forth. But that was never really the goal of any of these grand hotels on the Upper East Side. The goal here was always to serve New Yorkers. Yes, there were public rooms, and we'll look at them and they are grand. But the reality of it is that these buildings were built so sumptuously and so beautifully because they were being built into the cityscape for the city, for people who were living here. And the question was, when we turned into the new century, when we became part of the 20th century, was how will we live now in New York, and who will live here, and what will it look like? And the answer was, okay, we're not going to live now in these major Gilded Age mansions. We're going to live in these apartment hotels. And when we do that, what will it mean for us, and what will it look like? And so the goal here was to create an extraordinary experience, yes, to a degree for the public, but more so for New Yorkers themselves. And to this day, I think the Plaza does, which I think is a really kind of special thing to think about, that it was always for New Yorkers. But who were some of those early New Yorkers? We talked about Alfred G. Vanderbilt, but who else? Well, let's remember that the original residents actually had their own dining room, and each permanent resident would, if he was living alone at the Plaza, he or she would have his or her own table. Or if you were living as a couple or as a family, each family would have their own table in the permanent residence dining room, which I think is kind of fun. And some of the earliest permanent residents came collectively to be known as the 39 Widows of the Plaza. They were great dowagers of their time who lived for many, many decades at the Plaza. One is this woman. This is Princess Vilma, who moved into the Plaza, the Serene Highness of Russia, who moved in and lived with a menagerie here at the hotel, including a lion cub who lived in her bathtub. Now, another whom I particularly like, this is Clara Bell Walsh. Clara Bell Walsh moved into the Plaza Hotel on opening day, October 1st, 1907, and lived at the hotel until her death 50 years later in 1957. Now, you actually see her here photographed in her suite at the Plaza. And what's so lovely about her is that she is actually credited with inventing the cocktail party. Now, many hotels have invented certain cocktails. They claim at the St. Regis, of course, to have invented the Bloody Mary, but they can't claim to have invented the cocktail party that goes to Clara Bell Walsh. Now, even though somebody like Clara lived at the hotel for 50 years, the hotel really changed around her. There were additions and renovations that went on throughout that period of time. The most notable would be the addition of the terrace room by Warren and Wetmore between 1919 and 1921. Warren and Wetmore are best known, of course, for Grand Central Terminal, but they also made this addition to the Plaza Hotel. There is also Schultz and Weaver's Grand Ballroom from 1929. Schultz and Weaver, if you remember, also designed the Pierre, the Sherry Netherland, and the Waldorf Astoria in 1931. The photo that I have here for you is one that I enjoy. This is the cartoonist ball held in the Grand Ballroom of the Plaza in 1951. Now, speaking of changes, that's not the only one. Something happens in 1920, which is Prohibition, right? And so hotels have, as you can imagine, a bit of a slump as soon as the Volstead Act is unveiled. Of course, because of Prohibition, there will be speakeasies throughout the city, so on and so forth. But when it's repealed in 1934, there is a burst of rejuvenation in hotels. And one in particular at the Plaza, which I love, is the Persian Room, which was designed by Joseph Urban in 1934. So I have two views for you of the Persian Room. I have this one, and then this one, which I like, from 1948. Look at that Art Deco splendor, right? The mirroring. Now, if you're looking at this and you think to yourself, my God, that looks like a theater, you're right, because Joseph Urban was chiefly a theater designer, actually. He designed the Ziegfeld Theater, most famously. He also designed, interestingly enough, the New School building on 12th Street in 1919, which is considered to be the first international style building in New York City. For our own time, of course, we have a president today. That president spends a lot of time, as you know, at Mar-a-Lago. That building, Mar-a-Lago, was also designed by Joseph Urban. Now, I'll take you next to the Oak Room at the Plaza. Why? Well, until 1934, until the end of Prohibition, the Oak Room was actually called the Men's Bar. I am so sorry that on this PowerPoint that says some kind of crazy number, but that's supposed to say Oak Room at the Plaza 1974 is when that photo was taken. Now, the Oak Room at the Plaza may not have been called the Men's Bar anymore post 1934, but it actually catered to men only until 3 p.m. Until the 1970s, there was a sit-in. Betty Friedan in 1969 staged a sit-in at the Oak Room in order to protest the fact that women were not allowed into the Oak Room prior to 3 p.m. And why prior to 3 p.m., you might ask? Because the stock exchange was open. And if the stock exchange was open, then the Oak Room had to be men only, because men, I suppose, needed to trade stocks in private without women. What can I tell you? Now, as we transition from the 1930s into the 1940s, we'll also transition hotel ownership. Conrad Hilton will buy the Plaza Hotel in 1943. But something else happens at the Plaza, which I think is quite interesting during the war years. I began this talk speaking about the fact that these hotels were built primarily to be residential. And I think one way to really talk about that during the war years is to say that the Plaza had a 3-day maximum stay. If you were not a permanent resident of the hotel, you could only stay for 3 nights at a stretch. Why, do you think? Spies. New York City was a major hotbed of espionage during the Second World War. It has been actually throughout its history, but during the Second World War, it was truly, truly a crucible of cloak and dagger work. And what I have to tell you about that is that New York's hotels were deeply involved in the clandestine dealings of the Second World War, but not at the Plaza, right? Because what good would it do you if you were a spy to be checking in and checking out all day long? So where did the spies meet? Not here, somewhere else, here at the St. Regis. Essentially, an entire secret war was being waged at the St. Regis Hotel during the Second World War. And I know what you're thinking. Yes, this is 2 East 55th Street. In a technical sense, this is not the Upper East Side, but I had to include this because it is so wonderfully exciting that I wanted to share it with you. I love these stories. Now, the St. Regis Hotel was built by Trowbridge and Livingston in 1904, and it was commissioned by John Jacob Astor IV. John Jacob Astor IV died on the Titanic in 1912, and when he died, the deed for this hotel passed to his son, Vincent Astor. Vincent Astor is on the left. Now, Vincent Astor was very good friends with Franklin Roosevelt, who in an obvious sense here is on the right. Now, Vincent Astor, because he was good friends with Franklin Roosevelt, had gotten involved in the secret world quite early on. Now, Vincent Astor had a townhouse at 34 East 62nd Street, which is on the Upper East Side. Now, I don't have a picture of that townhouse for you because actually it was destroyed. There was an explosion, not during the war, it was not sabotage. There was an explosion in 2006. But that was the Astor townhouse. And as early as 1926, Vincent Astor created something called The Room, which was essentially a gentleman's club where society swells would trade information. So people like Nelson Doubleday, David K. Bruce, Winthrop Aldrich, they would trade society intrigue, as well as international financial affairs and so on and so forth. And what Vincent Astor would do is he would simply send this information to his friend Franklin Roosevelt. So by the late 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt turns to Vincent Astor and asks him to take a yacht cruise to Japan to try to suss out the war in the Pacific, which of course has not come to the United States yet. Pearl Harbor, not until 1941, but there is, since the invasion of Manchuria in 1937, there is clear hostility, right, in the Pacific theater. And FDR says to Vincent Astor, why don't you go in and look at that? Which FDR does, and which Vincent Astor does. And Vincent Astor then is able also, because he is sort of in the same world as, let's say, the Rockefellers at Chase Bank, he's able to send information about Axis financial dealings because the Rockefellers owned Chase Bank. So in 1941, now, FDR decides to make Vincent Astor a commander in the US Navy and makes Vincent Astor responsible for all intelligence gathering within the New York area. So it starts to seem as if Vincent Astor is going to be spy chief for the United States of America as we enter the Second World War. But the Second World War is a larger conflict than any that had come before. And sooner or later, Franklin Roosevelt decides that he needs somebody a little more seasoned than Vincent Astor to run this incredible spy network. So he turns to this person. This is Wild Bill Donovan. Wild Bill Donovan is actually the most decorated veteran of the United States Armed Forces ever. He is the only American to win all 4 of the nation's highest honors. He returned from fighting the First World War as the most highly decorated person in the American Expeditionary Force. He was a lawyer. He was a boxer. He was, you name it, he did it. He ran for governor of New York. He, turned down a post as Secretary of War. He was very, very involved. But my favorite assessment of him comes from the Hollywood director and later OSS officer John Ford. Now, the reason that John Ford knew him is because Wild Bill Donovan single-handedly created the Office of Strategic Services, which was the wartime forerunner to the CIA. It was the first centralized intelligence agency in American history. And John Ford said of Bill Donovan that Bill Donovan was the kind of man who thought nothing of parachuting into France, blowing up a bridge, pissing in Luftwaffe gas tanks, then dancing on the roof of the St. Regis with a German spy. Now, why do I bring up the roof of the St. Regis? Well, it was at the St. Regis Hotel that Wild Bill Donovan met this person, William Stevenson, who was his counterpart in British intelligence. William Stevenson ran the BSC, the British Security Coordination, from 630 Fifth Avenue in Rockefeller Center. And he jockeyed in London and in Washington to get his friend Bill Donovan into what would become his role as the director of the OSS. So he does. And both the Office of Strategic Services and the British Security Coordination throughout the war operated from Rockefeller Center. Okay, fine. But what does that have to do with hotels? Well, not only did Donovan and Stevenson meet at the King Cole Bar at the St. Regis, but they actually returned once a week for the duration of the war to have drinks here at the King Cole Bar. And not only that, they also celebrated VE Day here. And for an entire month in 1942, the St. Regis Hotel became the center of American intelligence operations because Donovan had gotten hurt and he went directly to his suite at the St. Regis and directed intelligence operations from there, which is why that the invasion of North Africa and the clandestine work around it, so all the espionage around the invasion of North Africa in 1942, which was known as Operation Torch, was actually planned at the St. Regis Hotel. But that is not the only maneuver planned at this hotel. Meet one of my favorite hoteliers of all time. This is Sergei Obolensky. Now, Sergei Obolensky is the kind of man that you could not make up if you tried. Sergei Obolensky became involved with the St. Regis because he married Alice Astor. And the reason that he married her was because he was an ousted white Russian prince. Okay, so we have the Russian Revolution. He's got to flee. He does. And by flee, I mean that he spent his youth in all of the finest hotels of Europe. So when he divorces Alice Astor in 1924, her brother Vincent Astor simply says, you know what, Sergei? You actually are qualified to be a manager of this hotel. You have spent your entire life in the greatest hotels of Europe. I would like for you, please, to run this hotel. Which he does to absolute acclaim. He's actually credited when I said that the King Cole Bar claims to have created the Bloody Mary. It's he who is given that honor of having created it. But the heat of cocktails, right, has nothing on the heat of war. So Sergei Obolensky had won the Cross of St. George in the Russian cavalry and during the First World War. And during the Second World War, he wants to go overseas again. but he's very old at this point. Not very, I'm sorry, I don't mean very old. He's old for a soldier. He'd be too old to enlist. He was 53. And he turns to William Donovan, who was staying at the hotel, as I told you, was always at the St. Regis. And he asks Donovan if he can please have a post in the commando unit. So just by being at the hotel, in fact, he gets one. And so he becomes the nation's oldest combat paratrooper, and he wins not only awards in the United States, but also he'll get the Croix de Guerre for this as well, for daring midnight jumps into Sardinia and occupied Paris. So you're thinking, wow, that's pretty exciting. But guess what? Sergei Obolensky is not done yet. So what happens to Sergei Obolensky when the war is over? Well, he just comes back to his beloved hotels. And where does he find himself? Not at the St. Regis anymore, but back at the Plaza. Why? Well, he creates the Rendezvous at the Plaza, which is a new nightclub at the Plaza in 1947, and it is a very sumptuous place. It's high drama. It's high drama because we're at an ebullient point, right? We've won the war and we want to celebrate. And how better to do that than with flaming swords and ice sculptures, says Sergei Obolensky, which is what he gives us at the Rendezvous at the Plaza. But the idea of that kind of high drama is part and parcel of the 1950s at New York hotels. Why do I say that? Well, this idea of the arts coming into this place of high luxury is something that begins to happen. This is the Art Students League Ball in 1954. I found this photo within the collection of the Museum of the City of New York. And I tell you that because I hope when this lecture is over that you will search the Art Students League Ball within the photo collection of the Museum of the City of New York, because you will find this is the tamest photo that I could find. I will tell you that. It was a wild romp, that particular Art Students League Ball. I hope you do check it out. It seemed like a lot of fun. But when it comes to balls at the Plaza, this one was held there. There is only one ball, I think, that matters. And it is this. It is the black and white ball, 1966. Now, there was an article in the Times about this entitled, "What if you threw a party and everybody came?" Now, the black and white ball was of some real social and historical import, which is kind of funny to say about a party. You might think, how could anything that is a costume party or a social function be of real social and historical import? But it absolutely was, because this was really the first time in New York society that you had an intermixture of worlds, which is not unusual today. In fact, this is what made it usual, that you would have somebody like Babe Paley or Nelson Rockefeller or any member of these society swells dancing, with a writer like Mary McCarthy or Truman Capote or Alfred Kazin, you name it, they were there. It's a situation where on the one hand, you have Tallulah Bankhead, on the other hand, you have James Baldwin. And it was such a sort of interesting cross-section of the city, of its sort of blue bloods and its literati, I suppose you would call it, that the New York Times actually published the guest list in the paper itself. And it was really the first time that you saw that kind of mixture of old money and celebrity, that this could be a place not only, right, for the widows of the Plaza, right, the old dowagers who had been living at the Plaza for years and years and years, but of the whole city sort of coming to these hotels. And when I say the whole city, I mean that there's a kind of energy that begins really to hum in the 1960s that is indicative of the social change of that decade. And what I think is really interesting, right, is that I had mentioned that in 1969, Betty Friedan stages a sit-in at the Oak Room, and that you start to get a kind of new way of thinking within these hotels. And so I think what's really indicative of that perhaps would be something like this. So Salvador Dali meets Andy Warhol for the first time at the St. Regis in 1964. So you can see all of this sort of social upheaval and fecundity going on, not only, within artistic enclaves or something in Greenwich Village, but really here at the highest echelons of New York society. But this is the Friends of the Upper East Side Historic Districts. And so I have to tell you that, okay, we have all this excitement in the 60s, but what's exciting for us as preservationists in the 60s? Well, the most exciting thing, right, in the 60s as a preservationist is the Landmarks Law, 1965. And the Landmarks Law, as you well know, begins to save properties that were slated for demolition. And one that did not get saved, unfortunately, is this. This is the Savoy Plaza Hotel. This was designed by McKim, Mead, and White, built 1927, demolished 1965. Now, speaking of permanent residents, the resident of the penthouse here was the founder of Paramount Pictures, Adolf Zucker. And what I think is so interesting about this was slated for demolition in 1964 to make way for the General Motors building. And there was a major movement within the preservation community to save this building. There was an action group for better architecture in New York that led the fight to save the Plaza Savoy. In fact, preservation advocates actually held a funeral march for the hotel at Grand Army Plaza, and 100 students and faculty of the Cornell University College of Architecture actually gathered in the rain to protest the demolition of this hotel. In fact, they had a slogan called "Don't Blast the Past." And because the General Motors building was going to supplant this building, they called for a boycott of General Motors. So we can actually see the 60s in a way playing out in these hotels, which I think is really interesting. But the ultimate 60s hotel, I think, is the Carlyle. This was known as the New York White House during the Kennedy years, but it has even a longer history than that. Now, the Carlyle was built in 1930 in the same way that the other hotels that I mentioned were. It was built chiefly to be residential, but it did something really interesting, which the other ones did not do, which is that this hotel was built along the English residential hotel plan known as London Chambers, which means that there were separate entrances for hotel guests and for private residents. So to the south, you had the hotel itself, and to the north, on the same property within the same structure, you had private residences. Now, these residences, when they opened in 1930, had apartments that ranged from 1 to 9 rooms and rented for up to $20,000 a year. Now, according to the New Yorker magazine, these apartments were intended for those who live in hotels from choice, and not because they ran away from their families or are doing penance in cubicles. No cubicles. Like the other hotels we've seen, there is a lot of magic here, right? Now, these, as I think you know, are murals painted by Ludwig Bemelman at Bemelman's bar, depicting Madeline, right? Now, the reason that I mention that the Carlyle, just like the other hotels that we talked about, was a residential hotel is because I want you to know that Bemelman, when he painted these murals, he did so. What do you think he did it for? What do you think he got in exchange? Was he paid? No, he got 18 months free rent at the Carlyle, right? He lived at the hotel for a year and a half in exchange for these murals. Now, the idea of art, right, was not foreign to the Carlyle. I've just talked about the notion of art kind of, if you like, invading the Plaza, if you want, right, in the post-war years. But the Carlyle was really sort of moved by art even from the beginning. Why? Well, One of the very first tenants who ever lived at the Carlyle was a man named Chester Dale, who later actually became the first president of the National Gallery of Art. Why do I mention Chester Dale, other than because of the art? Well, his apartment at the Carlyle was later sold to JFK. It was 34A. And Kennedy owned that apartment at the Carlyle for the last 10 years of his life. Now, speaking of sort of gems, if you like, when I talk about the way that we can see the history of New York through these hotels, right, going from the Gilded Age to the Art Deco period into the post-war years, so on and so forth, we can also see something that happens in the 1970s, which is that New York hits a fiscal crisis in the 1970s. And so there were, within these hotels, a number of robberies. One was at the Carlyle, another one was at the Pierre. This is evidence of the Pierre jewel heist. This was actually the largest and most successful jewel heist in American history. This took place in 1972. And the reason that I mention this, right, is because, again, these are spaces, these hotels were built for New Yorkers, for the city of New York, and we see that their fortunes are tied to the fortunes of the city itself. Now, speaking of criminals, right, in the 1980s, the Plaza changes ownership to somebody who is now the president. And when that happens, there's a question of what will happen to the Plaza. Are those hotel rooms going to be made into condos? What's going to happen? And this is a question that persists throughout the current president's ownership and into the 21st century as the Plaza changes hands. And the reason that I mention that is because I'm going to speak now about the fact that the interior of the Plaza was actually landmarked in 2005. For that reason, there was a lot of fear that the ownership at that time were going to, in an effort to create condominiums within the Plaza Hotel, and entirely condominiums without any kind of transient hotel rooms, that they were going to destroy the public spaces within the Plaza, because the thinking would go, well, you know, if it was going to be an entirely residential hotel, what was really the point of these public spaces? And so for that reason, the Landmarks Preservation Commission was actually able to step in 2005 and save the public spaces within the Plaza, which is really quite a wonderful coda to the role of the LPC within this story, right? That in 1965, it was not able to save the Savoy Plaza, but was able to save the interiors of the Plaza in 2005. So that's something that's really quite special. But the reason that I end on that note is because it's interesting to me to think about that. You know, there was an editorial in the Times in 2005, you know, like a plea for the Plaza, save the Plaza, you know, this idea that it would be against the tradition of the hotel or you know, an affront to the city of New York if this became entirely residential. And while I was creating this talk, I was really thinking about that, because I thought, well, you know, what was the goal of this hotel or any of these hotels on the Upper East Side, you know, when they were built? And while there has always been transient rooms, there have always been guest rooms in all of these hotels. You know, the real goal here was as private residences for the city, to be built into the city, and that there would be public rooms so that you could have this engagement with the city itself, and that the fortunes of these buildings were always tied to the city, and we could see the movement of time and the movement of culture through these public rooms. But I think that there is a lot of, at least in the press and so on and so forth, a lot of comment about the privatization of these buildings. And while any opinion about that is fine, and I certainly have strong ones, I think too it's interesting to look back at that history and say, well, you know, who were these buildings built for? And what does it mean? Like, what does preservation mean? Because what are we actually preserving when we look back at this history? So that's a question that I came to my mind as I was researching this lecture. And if you guys have any questions, I would love to talk or to be able to answer them or be in dialogue with you about that. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Lucy. Can everyone hear me? This was wonderful. And like I said, if you'd like to submit a question, please do so via chat. We're happy to take all your questions. Before I do, we start with the Q&A. Lucy, can I ask you to stop sharing the screen for now? And I'm also going to invite people to, if you're willing, to turn their videos on to have this conversation with Lucy. So let me go ahead here and let's start. Lucy, do you have a sense as to whether the apartment hotels operated as long-term residences or pied-à-terre? I never know how to say that. For people regularly coming here on holiday or on businesses?
Sure. I mean, I think it functioned in both ways, but to my knowledge, these were long-term residences that people were living here as they would have lived, within these gilded mansions. Absolutely.
Good to know. And just going back to the last question you posed when you ended this wonderful talk, do you have an answer for it?
I mean, what's so interesting is that I think all of the reading that I did about these hotels, people have very specific memories. I can tell you that my memory of the Plaza Hotel has to do with a chocolate shop that was there when I was very young, and that once a year, my parents would let me go in and buy a piece of chocolate at the Plaza. That chocolate shop is no longer there, and so that's what I think of. And there are people who came of age at a different time than I did, and they remember Trader Vic's, or they remember even something like the any number of these rooms that are no longer there. And to me, those public rooms are vital. And I think that the preservation in 2005 of the interiors of the Plaza were vital for that reason. But I don't know that the preservation of, residence versus hotel rooms are necessarily that, as a New Yorker, because I am one, that meaningful for me, because as a New Yorker, the only thing that I'm really going to engage with are those public spaces on the ground floor, which I think are vital in terms of bringing the city in, but what I think about is, well, what I think about in terms of preservation is the use for the city, because when these buildings were built, the use for the city was as apartment hotels, and that was the point. And so now I guess the question that I have is what is the use? As New Yorkers, what do we need, right? And so if those residences are for, like, I don't know, some kind of global elite, maybe that's not the right use for the city. But if New Yorkers themselves are using the hotel to its best advantage, I would be in favor of preserving whatever the needs of New Yorkers are. That's how I would say.
That's wonderful. And I think that so much has changed in this past, I was going to say few, but it has been a little bit over a few months since coronavirus started. I do have one question asking about getting a copy of this talk, and I'm happy to tell everyone this is being recorded and is going to be available for viewing on our website. We are reaching the top of the hour, so I'd like to thank everyone that came. Thank you, Lucy. Your talks are the most wonderful. I do remember the last one. Actually, Lucy led our last in-person event before we all went quarantined, and it was a hit like everything You do, Lucie. So thank you so much. Thank you for everyone that joined us in this cold first snow in New York City. And I hope to see you the next time.
It was a pleasure, everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.